So today we have a discussion of what peace means, right? I bring you peace not as the world brings peace, but as Christ brings peace. It's worth noting that throughout all of sort of Jesus' sayings and writings and sermons, he talks a lot about peace. When he first meets the disciples, when we're talking about doubting Thomas, what did he say? He says, "Peace be with you," right? And we hear this. Whenever we hear sort of a litany of what we as Christians should be about, like feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and fighting for justice, in that litany is often be peacemakers, right? And yet, today we are told that when Jesus says go be peacemakers, he means something different than what the world means. Which begs the question, what is it that God's getting at? Like, in what way is being a peacemaker in the way a Christian understands it fundamentally different than a peacemaker the way the world understands it? I think to understand the answer to that question, we have to flip the coin of peace over. And to understand peace, we got to understand war. Because the reality is, most of us don't. See, for most of us, when we think of the words of war and the word conflict, we think of it as basically the same thing. A conflict is a war, and a war is a conflict. But the reality is it's not. See, a conflict is when a fight is occurring. A war is when people have the willingness to fight. Right? You can beat an enemy's armies and end the conflict. But if you don't defeat the people's will to fight you back, the war will keep going on, and one little conflict here and another here and another here. Right? Now, and it makes sense for us in our modern world why we think of it as the same. If you look at a place like World War II, or you look at World War II, when the German and Japanese armies eventually surrender, there really isn't any further conflict because the people were done fighting. The German people, the Japanese people didn't want the conflict to continue by the time it ended, right? So when the conflict ended, so did the war. But that isn't always true. All you have to do is look throughout history to find times where the war ended and the conflict didn't, or the conflict ended and the war didn't. I'll give you an example. Look at Iraq or Afghanistan. Modern conflicts. You have this moment in Iraq, not so much in Afghanistan, where the then President Bush stands on an aircraft carrier with the sign "Mission Accomplished." Because the conflict was over at that point. The Iraqi army had been defeated. They had no air, sea, or land power. All their major cities were occupied by U.S. and allied forces. The country was basically under U.S. and allied control. The Ba'ath Party had been dissolved. Most of the government was captured, killed, or had dispersed. Saddam Hussein's hiding in a spider hole somewhere. Right? So the conflict is over. But the people of Iraq weren't done fighting. And so we'll go from one conflict to another for 20 more years. Because suddenly over here in Basra, you'll have an uprising, and over here you'll have another group, and over here you'll have another group. A conflict, a conflict, a conflict. And for 20 years, we'll sit there playing whack-a-mole with different groups popping up, causing more conflicts. Why? Because the war wasn't over. Same in Afghanistan, right? Conflict and war is different. You win a war by breaking the opponent's political will. You win a conflict by breaking their military capacity. Those aren't always the same. The Assad regime. Assad and the world did not realize that he had lost the war, even though he had won the conflict. If you went 2 years ago, Assad had recaptured almost all the major cities in Syria. Yeah, way out in the hinterlands, you had a U.S. base, and way out in the hinterlands, you had, the PKK and other sort of Kurdish groups fighting. Yeah, the sort of Islamic groups were packed up next to the Turkish border, surrounded by Assad forces, right? And then overnight, his army's just like, yeah, we're done, right? They just marched in from one place to another, and Assad would be like, well, I'm going to deploy troops, and next thing you know, his troops were just gone to nowhere. Hadn't been defeated, hadn't fought, hadn't died. They just vanished. Right? We all saw that, where in 2 weeks, what looked like a war that Assad had won all of a sudden just stops. he thought he had more or less won the conflict. He had lost the war because he lost the will from his own people to fight. I bring this up because when the world talks about peacemakers, we too often think of it as those who end conflict, not those who end war. Which leads us into these worlds in which we think, good, it's all done. And you have a mission accomplished banner behind you. And it's far, far from done. And this doesn't just apply to sort of international relations. This doesn't just apply to the wars that we have lived out in our lives and in the sacrifices of so many heroes. This lives out in the big picture, the medium picture, and the small. Because what happens in a lot of our times is we can be at war with ourselves as a community, as a nation, if we have the willingness to want to hurt the other. We have that in politics. There are people on both the right and the left that back all sorts of positions, not because they think it's best for everyone, not even because they think it's best for them, but because they think it's going to hurt the other side. There isn't conflict, but there's a heck of a lot of war out there. Any form of hate is a form of war. Racism is war. Now, does it break into conflict? Sure, because it does break into violence from time to time, right? We have cases like that. People think, like, just because I stopped the conflict, that you've stopped the war, but you haven't. Not if people's hearts are filled with hate. Not if they wish harm to the other, no matter who that other is. Not if they're willing to go to war with the other or go to conflict at a moment's notice. They're already at war. They're just not yet in conflict. We as Christians aren't here just to stop the conflict and say, everyone out of the pool, or everyone to your corners, but to then resolve whatever the underlying issue is. It's not just about getting everyone into their corners and making sure everyone stops throwing rocks at each other. It's about getting down to why are we throwing rocks at each other, and then healing and resolving the war underneath. That's why we as Christians talk about these things. That's why we as Christians struggle with these things. But it's not just on the community level. This can be on your family level. Think about it. How many of you, when you get around like the Thanksgiving table or 4th of July barbecue or something like that, has a briefing beforehand that goes, all right, now Uncle so-and-so is going to be there. Now, we all know Uncle so-and-so, so what we're not talking about is this, that, and this, right? Folks, that means there's a war in your family, and you're doing everything to stop the conflict. We as Christians, obviously stopping the conflict is step one of ending a war, because until people stop throwing rocks at each other, you're not going to get people to sit down and talk about why they're throwing rocks at each other, right? But we don't just as Christians stop there. If we're true peacemakers, we go to that deeper level. We sit down and say, okay, where's the hurt? Where's the hurt? Usually on all the sides. How can we bring down the simmer of hatred that lives in everyone's heart about this issue, this person, this thing, whatever it is? That's what makes us unique as Christians, or at least one of the things, when we talk about what it means to be community. Because the goal is not that we have a frigid relationship with each other where everyone simply goes, okay, I won't throw rocks at you. But rather, we have this passionate, close, loving, dynamic relationship where I see you for who you are and love you for who you are, no matter who that is. It's when I stop wanting harm to you, no matter who you are. This is the difference between the peace of the world and the peace of Christ. Christ wants war to end, not conflict to be delayed. So as you go out, take some time in your life and ask yourself, how are you being a peacemaker in your family, in your group of friends, in your community, in your nation, and in your world? Not the way the world asks you to be, but the way God asks you to be. Amen.